Welcome back. Now that we have our box trace working in C++, we're ready to continue implementing Combat. Now, the next important step for us is to control when our overlap events for the box component on our weapon work. And the reason we need to control this is because we don't want to get overlap events and box traces when we're not actually attacking. And we can see the problem if we run up to this other character with our sword and we don't even have to attack. As soon as we get close, we start getting those overlap events triggered, which makes those box traces occur, and we all of a sudden have things happening that shouldn't be happening yet. So we don't want those overlap events triggered just yet. In fact, we only want them to be triggered when we're swinging the sword. So we can use anim notifies in our attack animations, and we can have our collision disabled until a very short window while we're attacking, where we enable it and then promptly disable that collision on our box component. So what we'll do is we'll go into our animations and open the attack montage where we have our attack 1 and attack 2. Now, you may have more attacks here as there was a challenge earlier for you to find other attack animations, and you may have added those, and that's fine if you did. We just need to make sure that we're enabling collision and disabling collision at the right point in time during every single one of these attacks. Now, what I'd like is to have our box collision turned off until we reach a point in the animation where we're about to swing. So probably right about here, we can enable collision for the box, and right about there, we're done with the swing, we can disable it again. So really, there's just going to be a short window here where we're enabling collision. And for this, I'm going to add another notifies track. And by the way, our attack end anim notifies are in this track called 1, but we can rename this track by clicking on it a couple times, and we can simply call this attack end. And that way, our notify tracks all have names, and we'll want another track for enabling collision. So let's go ahead and add a new notify track, and I'll call this enable collision. And we'll have a notify that we'll create right here, right about where we're about to swing the sword. So let's right-click on the Enable Collision track, add Notify, and select New Notify. And I'm going to call this Enable Box Collision. And I'm going to scrub forward a little bit, and right about here we'll have another Notify to disable box collision. And I'd like to have another notify track for this. So I'm going to add notify track and call this one disable collision. And we'll have our anim notify right about here where we're finished swinging. So I'll right click, add notify, new notify, and call this one disable collision. So now this attack animation has enable collision and disable collision. And we'll want this in attack 2 as well. So right about here is where we're starting to swing. So I'm going to right click in the enable collision track right here and add notify, and this time go to skeleton notifies because this enable box collision anim notify already exists. We just created it. So I'm going to add it right there. And then I'll scrub through to where that swing is finished right about there. And I'll right-click right here in the Disable Collision track, add Notify, go to Skeleton Notifies, and select Disable Collision. So now these anim notifies exist. Now, we're not doing anything with them yet, but we will. So I'm going to save this, and we'll go to the animation blueprint. I don't want ABP Echo IK. I want to click these 3 dots and choose ABP Echo. And we'll go to this animation blueprint and open the event graph. And here we can implement those new anim notifies. So I'm going to right click here and search for enable box collision and get that anim notify event. And I'll right click and search for disable box collision. And it looks like I called it disable collision. Let's go back and make sure. Yeah, I did call it disable collision. So I think I'd like these to be consistent. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that and delete both of these and instead create a new one called disable box collision. So I'm going to right click add notify, new notify, and call this disable box collision, just to be consistent. And I'll scrub through to this animation, right about to here, and I'll add disable box collision. So add notify, skeleton notifies, disable collision is still there, but that's okay. I'm going to use disable box collision instead. And back in the anim blueprint, I'll search for disable box collision, and now our anim notify names are consistent. Now, how are we going to disable and enable box collision? Well, I'd like to handle this from C++, which means I'd like to have a blueprint callable function for both of these cases. And we've seen that adding functions in C++, then coming back into the animation blueprint, can cause our nodes to get messed up, and we'd have to close the editor and restart. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and close the editor, saving everything, and we'll make our code changes and then launch the editor up fresh. So our character is going to need a couple of blueprint callable functions to enable or disable collision on the weapon that we have equipped. And before we do that, I'd like our weapon's collision for the collision box to be actually set to no collision from the start. And we can set the collision enabled here. Instead of query only, we can set this here to no collision, and that way there won't be any collision. So if I compile and launch the editor and press play, grab a weapon, and run into the other character, now we see that because the box is set to no collision, we don't get any collision, so we don't get that overlap, and therefore we don't perform a box trace. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the editor again. I just wanted to show you that. And now we want to enable collision in response to a blueprint callable function. And I'd like to add these to the character class. So the character will get whatever weapon it has equipped and enable collision for that. And for this, we'll make a couple of blueprint callable functions, and I'd like them to be public, as we're going to be calling these from inside the animation blueprint. So the first one will be a void function called enable weapon collision. And we'll make this a U function with blueprint callable. And we'll have another function for disabling. So we'll call this disable weapon collision. And this will be blueprint callable as well. Now, if we really wanted to, we could instead make a function that takes an input parameter. And the input parameter can be this enum, e-collision enabled. And then we can specify no collision or query only or something like that. And if you wanted to do that, then your input parameter type would be e-collision enabled. And notice if we enter the two colons, not only do we have all the options for enum constants, but we also have this, type. If we select type, then we're specifying that this input parameter is the e-collision enabled type, and we can call this collision enabled. If we did this, then the function would need this enum type passed in, and we could specify no collision or query only or something like that. So why don't we do it this way, as you'll learn more by seeing us doing it that way. So instead of enable weapon collision, let's give this a more appropriate name. We'll call it set weapon collision enabled. And that way we're setting it to a collision enabled type, and now the function is more versatile. So we'll go ahead and define this function. And this is going to be pretty simple. We're first going to check to see if we have a weapon equipped. So we'll say if equipped weapon. If we do have an equipped weapon, we're going to set its collision enabled. So we'll take equipped weapon and access that box component. Now, our weapon's box component is called weapon box, and it's private, which means we need a public getter to access it. And we can add a public section down at the bottom and put a public getter down there. Now, I know we have a public section up here at the top, but I like to keep my public getters and setters down at the bottom of my classes. So that's just my personal preference. And because this is a basic getter function, we're going to make it force inline, and it's going to return a uBox component pointer. And we'll call this function getWeaponBox. and it'll be const because it doesn't need to change anything. It just needs to return weapon box. And now we can access weapon box from within /character.cpp by calling from our equipped weapon, get weapon box. And from the weapon box, we can set collision enabled by calling set collision enabled. Now we are getting red squiggles because we're trying to use uBox component, which we don't have the include for, so we'll have to include that at the top. It's going to be in components /box component.h as we've seen. So once we've included that, now we can call set collision enabled and pass in an eCollision enabled type. Notice that that's the type here. And that's the type of our input called collision enabled. So we'll pass that straight in, and that way we'll set collision enabled on the weapons box. Now, we are accessing a pointer here, and that means this pointer should be checked to make sure it's not a null pointer. So we can add an AND while we're checking the equipped weapon. We can also check equipped weapon get weapon box. And these AND conditionals are always checked from left to right. So if it checks equipped weapon and it's null, it will not even check the second condition, so we won't risk trying to use a null equipped weapon pointer here. We'll never get to this if equipped weapon is null. If it's not null, then we'll proceed to check this pointer returned by get weapon box. If that's null, we won't make it inside the if check, and we won't try to call a function on a null pointer, because that would give us a crash. All right, so after all that, we now have a blueprint callable function that we can use to enable or disable collision, and now it's time to go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to hit Control F5 to compile and launch the Unreal Engine editor. All right, so we're back in the editor, and we can open our ABP Echo animation blueprint where we have our anim notify events, and we want to call those blueprint callable functions. And we want to do that by getting our /character. So we can copy our validated get, and from /character, we can search for set weapon collision enabled. And notice that it takes an input of this enum type, which conveniently has a dropdown here in Blueprints. And that's great because all we need to do for enable box collision is set collision enabled to query only. That's what it was before we set it to no collision in the constructor. And we can copy these nodes, and for disable box collision, we can set it back to no collision. And now the collision will only be enabled for a short window in our attack animations. So let's go ahead and test this. I'm going to grab a weapon, and if I run up and just let this sword hit the Echo character, nothing happens. But if I attack, looks like I missed. I'll move in closer. If I attack, now I hit the other character, and I get that actual overlap event. We get the box trace, and this is working great. If I swing at this wall, looks like I didn't get a hit from the box trace, so I do need to make sure to not miss, and that works great. So now we don't get overlap events when we shouldn't get them. And this is a better way to handle things because we don't want to be walking around and just get a hit if we're close to something. We want to have to actually attack in order to get that hit. Perfect. All right, we're one step closer. We're ready to start actually hitting things and making stuff happen. Great job. I'll see you in the next video.